George Osborne's message today: recovery is taking longer than expected, but the British economy is healing. Turning back now would be a disaster. But he had to admit to a prolonged period of weak growth, higher borrowing and another 6 years of cuts. More pain, lasting longer than the public was promised by the coalition. Labour said the statement revealed the true scale of the government's economic failure. Taking a hit in the Chancellor's statement were benefit claimants, wealthier pensioners and many working families. Here's what we know. With lower than expected growth and higher borrowing, the austerity cuts will continue to 2018. That's over halfway through the next Parliament. Some benefits are squeezed with only a rise of 1%, which in real terms is a cut as it's below the level of inflation. And an expected 400,000 more people will be in the 40% tax rate. But some good news for business, as corporation tax is cut by 1% to 21% in 2014. And as expected, the 3p a litre increase in fuel duty planned for January is gone. Later in the programme, we'll be unravelling more of the detail and what it actually means. But first, our political editor Gary Gibbon on a parliamentary performance.
The long, hard road just got longer and harder. George Osborne had promised that around now we'd be halfway to the destination, the end of austerity. But today's figures show we're not even a third of our way through the trip. And the cutting will carry on into 2018.
Mr. Speaker, it's taking time, but the British economy is healing. After the biggest financial crash of our lifetimes.
Labour jeered, knowing that the Chancellor was about to have to admit he'd failed to meet the deficit target, which he and David Cameron had made their badge of fiscal honour.
In 5 years' time, we would have balanced the books.
We're on course to balance the books by the end of this Parliament.
That proud pledge, bringing down borrowing as a share of the economy's size by the end of this Parliament, was broken with no fanfare, just some cold Treasury prose.
We do not meet the supplementary objective that aims to have debt falling by 2015-16.
Labour thought the borrowing record deserved more attention.
It's rising in 2015 and it's rising again in 2016 too, breaking the fiscal rule for falling debt upon which this Chancellor said his entire credibility depended.
The Chancellor repeatedly said borrowing was coming down. And it is, in part thanks to the sale of 4G being slotted into this year's numbers. But since George Osborne's first projections in his 2010 budget, borrowing's gone way off course. In his budget this spring, lack of growth meant the government had to borrow much more. Only 9 months later, and he's come up with another set of borrowing figures, still coming down over time, but each year he's borrowing more than he last planned.
Over £212 billion more borrowing than they promised 2 years ago, cutting taxes for the rich while struggling families and pensioners pay the price. Unfair, incompetent and completely out of touch.
The worst reply to an autumn statement I have ever heard in this House.
Lack of growth lies at the heart of the Chancellor's problems and has framed the last 12 months' photo opportunities. He said he'd shift £5 billion in spending from Whitehall departments to projects like road building and new schools, and said there would be new tax incentives for investment and corporation tax down to 21%.
I suggest we cancel it altogether.
There were predictable cheers for the abandonment of the 3p rise in fuel duty. Big Tory cheers too for 3.7 billion cuts in the welfare budget. By capping working age benefits like job seekers allowance, income support, tax credits and child benefit below inflation. George Osborne sold it with a swipe at the jobless, who've done better than those in work.
Those on out-of-work benefits have seen their incomes rise twice as fast as those in work. We have to have a welfare system that is fair to the working people who pay for it. Fairness is also about being fair to the person who leaves home every morning to go out to work and sees their neighbour still asleep living a life on benefits.
George Osborne talked about people who don't get up in the morning and that we had to make sure they don't get too much money. Are you worried he's stigmatising the unemployed?
Well, I'm appalled at the whole idea of stigmatising.
Do you think he's doing it?
I don't know why he used that phrase.
Well, he talked about it at the conference as well.
I wouldn't have used that phrase, and I don't use that phrase. I'm sure most people who are out of work are looking for work.
The Tories proclaim they'd like to have cut even more from the welfare budget, but the Liberal Democrats prevented them. They also say they feel they're putting Labour on the spot. Do they back welfare cuts or not? Labour says it's going to take its time to make its mind up about that, but it does point out that an awful lot of the people who'll suffer real-term cuts in their benefits are not actually unemployed, but people in work.
With his grab at top-end pension pots, George Osborne said he was hitting the better off, as well as benefits and bureaucrats. But there'll be pain for less well-off families, public services, not just officials. And the opposition claimed he'd missed not just fiscal targets, but his political ones too.